This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 522 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Today's episode is pretty self-explanatory. Last week, I talked through regression candidates at the team level, and this week, I'll be doing the same thing on an individual player level. It's important to remember that everything trickles down from that team level. I talk about that all the time when it comes to projections. If a team is projected to have a certain pass rate or to score a certain number of touchdowns, then that's going to affect players on that team. The same can be said about regression. If a team far outperformed touchdown expectation one season, chances are the players on that team also outperform touchdown expectation. So on today's show, you're bound to hear about players who play for teams that I talked about last week. Not all of them, but some of them. And I want to say before I get going here, I'm not naming every single regression candidate on today's show. There are lots of them. What I'm trying to do with these episodes is help you see the very simple things that you can look for when spotting regression. But we also know that regression is just part of the equation here. Fantasy managers are sharper these days, so they recognize regression. Just because a player is supposed to see a decrease in production doesn't mean he's someone that you should automatically fade in drafts. Because if everyone feels that way, if everyone recognizes that someone's production is going to decrease, then he can actually sometimes become undervalued, not overvalued. So I'll do my best to talk about that side of things on today's show too. Now, before getting to the regression candidates, the 2021 NBA Finals are finally upon us, and FanDuel and Taco Bell are teaming up to add an extra layer of excitement to the action. Introducing the FanDuel Sportsbook Taco Bell NBA Finals Comeback Bonus. The terms are simple. All you have to do is head to FanDuel Sportsbook before tip-off and place a $25 or more pre-live moneyline bet on either team to win. If the team you bet on overcomes the halftime deficit to win, you'll be eligible to receive a $10 bonus in FanDuel site credit. You'll win your bet and you'll earn a bonus. Now that's more ways to win thanks to our friends at Taco Bell. Users must opt into the promo in order to be eligible for the bonus payment. Eligible every NBA Finals game until the bonus hits. Must be 21 years or older and present in Colorado, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, or West Virginia. Bonus issued as non-withdrawable site credit that expires in 7 days. Max bonus $10. Restrictions apply. See full terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-522-4700 in Colorado, 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa, 1-800-9-WITH-IT in Indiana, 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan, 1-800-GAMBLER in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Virginia, Tennessee Redline 1-800-889-9789, or visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net in West Virginia. It feels like any regression talk for this 2021 season has to start with the Green Bay Packers. On last week's show, I mentioned all the things that are working against the Packers this year. Most notably, they scored a really high number of touchdowns, and that's something that's not easily repeated. Aaron Rodgers drama aside, they're not going to be as good at converting touchdowns as they were last year. But last year, that high touchdown total resulted in a high passing touchdown total. Aaron Rodgers himself had a 9.1% touchdown rate. That's touchdowns divided by attempts. And that was the second highest rate in NFL history among quarterbacks with 300 or more attempts. If you want a very quick way to see if a quarterback is bound to regress as a passer year over year, look at touchdown rate. Since 2011, 19 quarterbacks had a touchdown rate of 7% or better while throwing at least 200 passes. 2 of those happened last year, so 17 quarterbacks had that 7% rate or better with next season data. Of those 17, literally none of them, 0 of them, saw an increase in touchdown rate the following year, and the average decrease was 2.4%. This isn't to say that Aaron Rodgers is going to suck wherever he plays next year. It's just that passing touchdown numbers regress to the mean. And by the way, this is why I always preach that this new wave of NFL quarterbacks, or what we're seeing across the league with quarterback rushing, that's a huge piece to helping the predictability of the quarterback position. Because before, quarterbacks were scoring a larger percentage of their points via the air. Since those numbers fluctuate, we'd get less predictability. The elite mobile quarterbacks in fantasy football aren't necessarily putting up these outlier seasons through the air. I mean, some of them have, like Lamar Jackson 2 years ago. But we saw what happens when that occurs. We get a literal league-winning season. This is why the quarterback position is changing. But this then has its own trickle-down effect. Like last year on the Packers, Robert Tonyan scored a touchdown on almost 19% of his targets. That was the second highest rate that we've seen over the last decade from a tight end with 40 or more targets. For context, the tight end who was a little bit better than Tonyan last year was Julius Thomas back in 2014. In 2015, Thomas scored 7 fewer times on 18 more targets with a new team when he went to Jacksonville. Same deal with Davante Adams. Adams scored a touchdown on over 12% of his targets last year. Of the more than 860 wide receiver seasons with 50 or more targets since 2011, that rate ranked 16th highest. Because those numbers aren't all that sustainable, that doesn't mean that I'm automatically fading Robert Tonyan and Davante Adams. Now, I do think that Tonyan's kind of tough to get behind this year, but he's also priced more reasonably than I would have expected. And Davante Adams may actually be a value at this point because of all this Aaron Rodgers speculation. Even though that touchdown per target number was high last year, he's had a couple of other seasons where it's been fairly high as well because he's good. We can't simply project him to see like 12 or 13 touchdowns, but that's always at least in his range of outcomes. Now, you can do this same exercise for other quarterback and pass catcher combinations across the league. 2 of them pop specifically into my mind, and that's with Mike Evans and Tom Brady, and then Adam Thielen and Kirk Cousins. I talked about Thielen on last week's mailbag episode, so I'll just reiterate some of those points. Thielen had 14 touchdowns last year, and 13 of them came in the red zone on 20 red zone targets. Among the 534 wide receiver seasons since 2011 where a wideout had 10 or more red zone targets, Thielen's rate of conversion to touchdowns was third best among that group. And by the way, anytime that you see funky numbers like this, you can always go back and look at that player's career and see if that player has done this before. Like Thielen had 20 red zone targets a couple of years ago, but that season he scored 6 times, not 13 times. This isn't an Adam Thielen thing. I mean, it is to some degree, but he was also lucky last year. Those types of numbers regress. And you can sort of tie that to Kirk Cousins too. Cousins threw 35 touchdown passes last year. That ended up being the most of his career in a single season. Unsurprisingly, his touchdown rate was also by far his highest at 6.8%. So expect that number to come down as well in 2021. Now, some of you may have questions about Justin Jefferson then if Kirk Cousins' numbers are going to decrease a little bit. Jefferson is a yards per target regression candidate without a doubt. He had an 11.2 yards per target rate last year, and players with that kind of efficiency tend to fall back the following year. But you could argue, depending on how you're looking at this stuff, that Jefferson should have scored an extra touchdown last year. Even if you think that he overperformed in the touchdown column, it wouldn't be by much. He didn't get utilized as much as we would have liked in the red zone, but he didn't do anything special with the 12 looks that he saw. And actually, if you look at the yards to touchdowns conversion that I tend to use at wide receiver, he underperformed in the touchdown column by 1.5 touchdowns. And by yards to touchdowns, for the record, I just mean looking at how many yards a wide receiver typically has per touchdown. Yards correlate to touchdowns, so it can be a predictor of regression. And Jefferson's 1,400 yards should have yielded between 8 to 9 touchdowns according to that formula. He only scored 7. Now, as I mentioned on last week's mailbag episode, I'm not worried about Justin Jefferson. He's a young talent and he's likely to see an uptick in target share. I'm far more worried about Adam Thielen. And then you could do a similar exercise that you did with Davante Adams, but do it with Mike Evans. Evans did see a lot of high leverage targets last year, including 8 of them from the goal line. There have only been 15 wide receiver seasons since 2011 where a wideout had more than 8 targets within the opponent's 5. That means that Evans' touchdown numbers, as long as those high leverage looks are maintained year over year, his touchdown numbers are naturally going to be higher than other players. But Evans is coming off a season with by far his highest touchdowns per target rate. So it's tough to see that 13 touchdowns automatically hit again next year. I think it's a lot more probable than what we'll see from like Adam Thielen, but Evans is someone who will likely regress, especially considering Tom Brady's 6.6% touchdown rate last season was the 3rd best of his career. Now, regression isn't just a one-way thing. Players or quarterback and pass catcher combos, they can get better statistically through regression too. And to spot them, just go through the same process. Find which wide receivers seem to score too few touchdowns based on their peripheral numbers, like red zone looks within the 10-yard line, end zone targets, touchdowns per target. Look at whatever you can look at, find players with underperforming numbers, and take a look at how their quarterbacks performed, mostly within touchdown rate. Like Evan Ingram. I know you probably don't care about Evan Ingram right now, but he's a pretty good example of an underperformer who also had an underperforming quarterback. Ingram scored 1 time last year, but he also had 109 targets and a 22% target share in the Giants offense. That should have yielded more than one touchdown and 8.8 PPR points per game. Depending on the formula that you're looking at, Ingram should have scored closer to 3 or 4 touchdowns last year. And what do you know? Daniel Jones finished with a 2.5% touchdown rate last season. He had just 11 touchdown passes on 448 attempts. Again, touchdown rate regresses. In this case, it'd be regressing favorably for Daniel Jones. Now, Kenny Golladay is there now to help him, and Babytron will hurt Ingram a bit. But this is just an additional point to last week's show. I'm expecting the Giants' offense to be much better this year than they were last year. Not just because of added talent, but regression too. I think you guys get the picture at this point. Start at the team level, see how efficient quarterbacks were with their attempts at scoring touchdowns, and then look at the pass catchers on those quarterbacks' teams. Chances are you're going to spot some obvious regression candidates. Now let's transition from touchdowns to something I talk about throughout the season, and that's air yards. A player with a lot of air yards and very little production, we'd expect that to regress to the mean. We'd expect that player who's getting a lot of air yards and not producing all that much to do more, to produce more. And I think the perfect example of this from 2021 was with Jerry Jeudy. Jeudy was 6th in air yards at wide receiver according to Next Gen Stats. The players ahead of him were Calvin Ridley, Tyreek Hill, DK Metcalf, Stephon Diggs, and DJ Moore. 4 of those guys finished in the top 7 in wide receiver scoring last year. DJ Moore was wide receiver 25. Jerry Jeudy, wide receiver 45. Things just didn't go Jerry Jeudy's way. His expected catch rate was 10 percentage points higher than his actual catch rate. He scored just 3 touchdowns despite 7 end zone targets and 8 red zone targets. It just didn't go well for him. This is a big reason that you'll see a lot of analysts in on Jerry Jeudy this year. And I don't disagree with that notion, especially if they somehow landed Aaron Rodgers. Now, I tend to use air yards more for in-season management to spot regression, but Judy's just such an exception that I needed to call him out. He should have been better last year, and not just because of talent. He was pretty unlucky. Let's shift our focus now to the rushing side of things. One regression candidate that I feel like doesn't get talked about enough as an actual regression candidate this year is Ezekiel Elliott. Zeke only scored 6 touchdowns last year on the ground. My weighted formula that looks at where a player is seeing his touches and the frequency in which he's seeing them had Zeke at over 11 touchdowns. I've seen other regression models have him at over 12. And what's interesting about that is that Dak Prescott last year had the opposite problem. Dak scored 3 rushing touchdowns on 18 attempts last year. That's by far his highest rushing touchdown rate of his entire career. This isn't to say that I'm not drafting Dak, because I think Dak could completely go off this year. But I'd expect with Dak in for the whole season, the touchdown rate that we saw last year is not going to be the same that we saw this year. The ratio between Dak touchdowns and Zeke touchdowns. And I'd also expect Zeke to convert his goal line rushes, especially with a healthy Dak, at a much higher rate. He had 26 rushes from within the 5 last year. He scored 5 times on those 26 rushes. Obviously, if you're inefficient there, you get more touches at the goal line. That's going to bring down your rate of scoring even more. But let me just offer you some perspective. In 2019, Zeke converted 10 of his 18 goal line rushes. Last year, it was 5 for 26. Here's some more perspective. Since 2011, there have been 23 running back seasons where a back had 20 or more goal line rushes. Keep in mind, Zeke had 6 more than that. Elliott is the first one in this sample to have not scored 6 times. And the average touchdown scored at the goal line among that group was 9. I know his ADP is high, but my projections really like Zeke this year. I like Zeke this year. I think he's a slam dunk mid-first rounder. And I feel kind of similarly about Cam Akers and how people aren't really talking about his favorable regression like I do with Zeke. Everything across the board looks pretty normal for Cam Akers. He performed around expectation in most categories last year based on where he was getting his touches, except rushing touchdowns. He only scored 2 times on the ground in the regular season, but my numbers, they say that he should have been closer to 6. Now, he scored twice in the playoffs, but people generally aren't working off of playoff numbers. It's one reason to be a little bit bullish on Akers, especially since the Rams tend to be a run-heavier team close to the goal line under Sean McVay. Now, the last player I want to touch on today's show is someone I brought up on a mailbag episode a month or 2 ago. But I think it wraps all of these pieces together really nicely, and it's Antonio Gibson. On last week's show, I mentioned how Washington was one of the teams with a pretty low pass-to-rush touchdown ratio last year. They had more rushing touchdowns than passing touchdowns, and that's something that generally regresses year over year. So in other words, Washington scored 34 touchdowns last year with 18 rushing touchdowns and 16 passing touchdowns. If we just assumed that they'd have a similar team, that they'd score 34 touchdowns once again, we should expect those 18 rushing touchdowns to drop and the 16 passing touchdowns to rise. Now, things change in offenses all the time year over year, and coaching staffs change. We can't just attribute a rise in passing touchdowns to just regression. We know Ryan Fitzpatrick is there now, and he's likely an upgrade. We know they added Curtis Samuel. But that also all plays into the fact that they're going to be a more favorable team through the air. So not only is there regression, but there's that too. So we should feel even more confident that things will look different statistically for Washington. Now that brings me to Antonio Gibson. As a running back on the football team last year, Gibson benefited from this type of ratio. Rushing touchdowns are good for running backs. Shocker. And we can see that in his numbers. According to my formula, he outdid his rushing touchdown total by almost 5 last year. I know that I've talked through this on the show before. I understand that. This is just a really, really good example. Now, this may seem like a bad thing for Gibson in 2021, but it's not. That touchdown ratio can rise and be more pass-friendly and not totally affect Gibson as long as, number one, Washington scores more overall touchdowns, and number two, Gibson is more involved as a receiver. I think number one is probably a lock given the quarterback upgrade. I mean, anything can happen, but we should feel good about Washington scoring more this year. That means any decrease we may see in touchdown ratio will be offset by more overall touchdowns, at least to some degree. And then if Gibson can see more work as a receiver, that'll help boost those numbers even further. Guys, this is how I view regression. Regression doesn't mean irrelevancy. It doesn't mean that you should fade someone, especially because a lot of fantasy managers these days are already embedding regression into their evaluations. So ADP is going to reflect that regression in some way. But regression is there to help you understand the how. How did this player do what he did? How is he going to perform moving forward after he did that thing? Having that knowledge and putting all those pieces of the puzzle together, that's what fantasy football is all about. And to me, the Antonio Gibson example is just the perfect example. It allows you to see how the team level numbers can impact the player level ones. And it shows you how regression can then be offset. That's how we should be looking at this stuff moving forward. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week with the mailbag episode.